Well, I appreciate Michael reading that passage. We'll be looking at that context there. If you want to keep your Bibles open to that section, always good to be together, to worship, and to praise our God. You know, confidence and courage often go hand in hand. I think there are Bible examples of that. Think of David, who fought against Goliath, and when Saul was trying to prepare him, he wanted to give him his armor, and David tried it on and said, "I don't need it." He said, "Actually, the God that has enabled me to fight the lion or the bear out there in the field as a shepherd will allow me to overcome against Goliath." And so he took on Goliath with great courage and was able to overcome. In the New Testament, think of the apostles who, after Jesus' death, were sort of hiding away. And then when they saw the risen Christ, they suddenly had a newfound confidence that translated into courage. And when the authorities threatened them, they said, "Well, you can threaten us, we're going to go on preaching." So there are numerous examples of how those things go hand in hand. The writer of Hebrews says at the end of chapter 10, verse 36, "For you have need of endurance." He's writing to his Jewish brethren, "so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised." And then he says, "For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay, but my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him." But then he adds, verse 39, "But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls." So he's encouraging them to have this faith, this confidence in God, and then with that confidence to courageously do what they need to do. Now, having said all of that, I think we recognize that it's easy to sometimes lose that confidence, and with that confidence sometimes goes that courage, the willingness to stand up or to say the word that needs to be said. And maybe even as we get older, instead of the vigor of youth, we find kind of almost a vacuum that's left with a diminished abilities that we once enjoyed. And maybe with that sometimes can go the willingness to be confident in God and be courageous in doing what he wants us to do. Well, with those thoughts in mind, let's look at the example of Caleb. Caleb was mentioned in that reading. And let's talk about the courage that he possessed. I think we're all familiar with his story here in Numbers chapter 14, but it won't hurt to look again at the narrative that's given to us. You'll remember that Caleb was one of the 12 spies that went into the land. And he was one of the 2 spies that came back and gave a good report rather than an evil report, as did his other 10 brethren. So if you go back a chapter to Numbers chapter 13, you'll find that mentioned in verses 1 and 2, God says to Moses, "I want you to send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel." Interesting. He says, I'm giving you this land. This is your land. "From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a chief among them." It's interesting that he refers to them as chief. I don't know if this means that these men had distinguished themselves as leaders among these different tribes. It certainly suggests that that might be the case. But among those is Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, verse 6. And also in verse 8, Hoshea, from the tribe of Ephraim. We would know him better as Joshua. And I guess those are probably similar names there. But anyway, he is said to be the same individual down in verse 16. And so God is going to give them this land, and he gives them instructions. So his instructions are, verse 17, Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, "Go up into the Negev and go up into the hill country and see what the land is, and whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, whether they are few or many, and whether the land that they dwell in is good or bad, and whether the cities that they dwell in are camps or strongholds." So what he's asking them to do is to kind of make an effort of reconnaissance, to evaluate the land, to evaluate the people in the land. Is the land a good land? Is it a land of quality? Is it a land of productivity? And what about its strength? What about the military might of those who are inhabitants? And so that's probably a very good strategy to undertake. especially if there's going to be a conflict. But then notice in verse 20, he goes on to say, be of good courage and bring some of the fruit of the land. Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes. And so they're going to go into this land that God has promised, and he has promised them all of this land that he has sent them out to search. So if you look at the map here, these are kind of the parameters of this area that they go to. Of course, you know they spend 40 days there, but if you can't probably read it at the top, there's a place called Lebo Hamath, which we'll read in just a moment. And that's kind of the northern extent. And then if you zoom in on this section down to the south, you can see the desert of Zin is that first corridor through which they go. And then they go up into Hebron. Verse 21 says, so they went up and spied out the land from the wilderness of Zin to Rehob near Lebo Hamath. And so Hebron is up there at the southern end of what we think of as Canaan. And you can see, maybe make out on the map, that there is this corridor of also mountains, what's called the hill country. And so there is a chain of mountains or hills that run parallel to the Jordan Valley there to the right. And this seems to be the area through which these spies go as they take on this mission. And so as they're sent into the land, they come to Hebron, it says, in verse 21. And then we're also told, verse 22, they went up into the Negev and came to Hebron. I read that. Ahiman, Shishai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, were there. Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. Interesting that they make a note of these descendants of Anak, which are a people who were famed and maybe feared for their great size as well as their military prowess. And there seems to be a connection later in verse 33. They are connected with this Nephilim that are mentioned way back in Genesis 6. And apparently, if the footnote I read is correct, I didn't do a lot of research, that word means giants. But the impression that's left is that these people in the land are bigger people, taller people. And so they make note of this as they come across them. All right, then in verse 23, we're told they came to the valley of Eshcol and cut down from there a branch with a single cluster of grapes, and they carried it on a pole between the two of them. They also brought some pomegranates and figs. And then we're told a little bit about that place. So there is the connection with each of these places. They take their 40 days, they spy out the land, and then having collected these samples, they come back to Kadesh Barnea, where the people were waiting and awaiting their report. Well, let's notice what happens when they return. Verse 25, at the end of 40 days, they return from spying out the land, and they proceed to then give a report. So look at verse 27. They told him, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey. So here's this proverbial milk and honey. And it must have been quite a contrast to the land in which they had been from the time they left Egypt, going out to Mount Sinai and then making their way up from the south towards Canaan. I have a picture here, one of Pharaoh's photos, and apparently this is a valley somewhere between Bethlehem to the north, which is up in the area of Jerusalem, and Hebron in the south. So we read about Hebron there a moment ago. We saw it on the map. Now, this may not particularly look to you like milk and honey. Pharaoh's comment on this was that you can see where they've done some terracing in order to grow crops there. Of course, this is 3,500 years after the fact, but just compare that to the land from which they had come. These are some pictures of more wilderness areas. Here is one that we would certainly think of as being in the wilderness, and here are some shepherds out there with their flocks. So you think of the children of Israel. They'd been out in that area, and now they're coming closer to this land that God had promised, the land that flows with milk and honey and its fruits. Well, what did the spies go on to say? However, they said, verse 28, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. So as good as the land was, it's well fortified. And you can only imagine those hills are good places to defend, but they're difficult places to capture. And that's what the advantage is of being up in elevation. Well, they go on and say, besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. And then they mention some of the other people in the land. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. So they kind of give an accounting of who's in the land. And I guess you would say, so far so good, except the inference seems to be, with these people who are there in these strong cities, it's going to be difficult for us, because verse 30 says, but Caleb quieted the people. Now, why is he having to quiet the people? It seems like they're already murmuring about the difficulty that's going to be involved in taking this land. And so it says, he quieted the people before Moses, but listen to his report, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are all able to overcome it. Whatever the challenge, whatever the difficulty, whatever the strength of those people, whatever their size, his evaluation is we can take this land. And so his message is to the people. Verse 32, they brought to the people of Israel, and this is the other spies, a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who came from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. So you can see what's happening here. They're already intimidated by the size of these people. And to be honest, size can be something that's very intimidating, can't it? When you see someone that's taller than you, I don't think of myself as tall, but once in a while someone will refer to me as such, or I'll come across somebody who's as tall as I am and I think, well, they're pretty tall. And then I think, oh, I guess I am too. When you run into somebody that's bigger or taller than you, that can be physically intimidating. And that seems to have happened to these people. And so as good as the land is, they've already capitulated in their minds to these people. They think of themselves, they say, well, we're like grasshoppers among these people. Why, we're just those little insects that are jumping around, and these people can just come and squash us if they want to. And then they assume that that's how the people think of them. I don't know that they'd had any interviews with those people, but they say, well, that's how we seem to them. And so they seem to have likened all the people to these Anakim, and they saw themselves as these insects, and they really viewed themselves as consumed rather than being the conquerors that God wanted them to be. So that's the frame of mind in which they find themselves. Caleb's attitude is different. He says, we can go and take the land. And they come back and say, well, the land's going to devour us. Well, let's see what the reaction is to their report. And the people, first of all, began to grumble. Verse 2 of chapter 14. They grumble against Moses and Aaron. They say, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land? To fall by the sword. Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? Isn't it always, or often the case, I guess we would say, that when a challenge arises and something difficult or adverse is in our path, it's so easy to think of, what it was like before. And so they can think back to Egypt, and despite all of the bondage in which they had served and God's great deliverance, it seems like they just think, well, we'd rather be back there than out here. And so there is this intense lamentation on their part. They bemoan the situation. And the problem, of course, is they don't really believe that God's power is great enough to enable them to take this land, that his promise is going to be fulfilled. And what they fail to see is really everything that's happened. We started in Exodus today, chapter 1. Everything that's happened from that point up to this point is to allow them, enable them to go into this land that God says, I'm giving it to you. But they lost confidence, as a result of which they lost their courage. Well, verses 5 to 10, it says that Moses and Aaron fell on their faces, and then Joshua and Caleb tear their clothes. They can't believe that the people are reacting in this way. Verse 7, they say to the congregation, the land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. So yes, it's good. We can take it. The Lord will allow us to do so. So he says, and they say in verse 9, only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. As I heard one person say, they're toast. They're going to be our bread. They're not going to take us. We're going to take them. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. Now, from a physical standpoint, it just seems like everything is against them. The odds are stacked against them. But what they're appealing to is a faith in a God who had delivered them thus far and could continue to do so. But listen to the reaction, verse 10. The congregation said to stone them with stones. Can you imagine? And this is a big group of people, isn't it? And so they are failing to believe in God. And so the Lord says to Moses, verse 11, how long will this people despise me? And how long will they not believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I have done among them? Well, we won't read it all, but the Lord threatens again, as on Sinai, to disinherit this people. He says, I'll start over if I need to. If they're unbelieving, I'll find someone who will believe. And of course, Moses jumps in again, as on Mount Sinai, and he intercedes for the people. He says, don't do this, please, Lord. The nations around will say, well, why did you bring them out here in the wilderness and then destroy them? Are you not able to bring them into the land? And so the Lord listens. Verse 18, he is indeed slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. He forgives iniquity. And so they ask, please pardon, verse 19, the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your steadfast love. And so the Lord pardons, but he also punishes. Look at verse 20. The Lord says, I have pardoned according to your word. And these are the verses that Michael read for us a moment ago. But truly as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers. And none of those who despise me shall see it. The Lord forgives, but he punishes these people. They're not going to be able to enter into this land. But there is an exception to that rule. Look at verse 24. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land into which he went, and his descendants shall possess it. So Caleb, for his faithfulness, and of course, Joshua, although we're reading only about Caleb here, are rewarded because they continue to trust in God, as they have urged the people to do. And notice that God says of Caleb that he is of a different spirit. What do you suppose that spirit is? Well, of course, he says he has fully followed the Lord there. He's followed me fully. I'm sure that Caleb was probably very positive, if this is any indication what he says on this occasion. He was optimistic, enthusiastic, but above all, he trusted that they could accomplish their goal because God said that they could. And so it is promised that he and his descendants will possess the land. Now drop down to verses 31 and 32. It continues there and says, "But your little ones who you said would become a prey, I will bring in, and they shall know the land that you have rejected. But as for you, your dead body shall fall in this wilderness." Couldn't be more of a poignant scene, could it? That here is this people who are poised to go into the land. They fail at the last moment, and now they're going to perish in the wilderness, although their children will be permitted to go in and to take the land. Well, that's the story of the 12 spies, but let's just follow up for a few moments. What happens after this point? If you turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 1, probably 38 years, if a couple of years had already taken place here, 40 years later, basically, Moses is now addressing the second generation ready to enter into the land. And let's just read his words in Deuteronomy 1, verse 34. Moses is recounting this to a generation that is new, in the sense that it wasn't the original one to whom God made the promise. So verse 34, the Lord, he says, heard your words and was angered, that is, this lack of faith. And he swore, not one of these men of this evil generation shall see the good land that I swore to give to your fathers, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, he shall see it, and to him and to his children I will give the land on which he is trodden, because he has wholly followed the Lord. This is the Lord saying that again. Even with me the Lord was angry on your account and said, you also shall not go in there. Joshua the son of Nun, who stands before you, he shall enter. Encourage him, for he shall cause Israel to inherit it. And again, those words about their children, they're not going to be prey. Actually, they're going to go in and possess the land. And so as you read through the book of Joshua, the early chapters, they go in, they take the land. God caused the wall of Jericho to fall, showing another sign. And then with other signs that he gives, the hail on one occasion, the making the day last on another occasion, they take first the southern part of Canaan, and then finally the northern part. And so when you come to Joshua 14, what you have is the reward that Caleb receives. So fast forward from that original setting we were in, about 45 years. And so here the people have come to Joshua, having conquered the land. They come to Joshua at Gilgal. It says, verse 6, they came to Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite said to him, you know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, in Kadesh Barnea concerning you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought him word again as it was in my heart. Now think with me for a moment. 45 years later, that's a lot of time for starters, isn't it? It's the same amount of time that Moses spent out in the wilderness as a shepherd after he'd slain an Egyptian. 40 years, 4 decades. That's basically a career in terms of working a job, isn't it? And so Jesus prepared himself 30 years before he began his ministry, long period of time. Well, here is Caleb, who, as he mentions here, has aged from 40 years old, we'll see in a moment, to 85 years old, 45 years later. Now think about that. Caleb had been faithful, and yet he and his generation were going to wander in the wilderness 40 years. So at age 50, where were they? They were out in the wilderness. There was Caleb along with them. At age 60, 65, time for retirement, here's Caleb out in the wilderness, and slowly he is seeing those around him perish. whether it's by plagues or it might be by war or maybe in some instances stoning or in one instance fire from heaven, maybe natural causes. Here are these 603,550, I think that's the count, of those men who are perishing one by one out in the wilderness as Caleb is aging. I mean, even that idea is that he is, in a sense, suffering along with those other people because of what had been done. And I would suggest that, as we think about our aging, we're all aging, aren't we? Little bit by little bit, day by day, year by year. We might experience the same kind of thing. As we grow older, the loss of contemporaries around us, those that we know. It might be that it's easier to lose touch. I think we could illustrate that in a number of ways. Our culture was something growing up, and then the culture that replaces us, changes go about, and we get to the point where we kind of don't recognize what the present young generation is doing. Well, that's kind of a normal way that life goes, but that can leave us feeling isolated. In Caleb's case, he had waited 45 years. But here, as they're dividing up the land, listen to what he says. This is at age 85. We just read verse 7. Verse 8, he says, "But my brothers who went up with me made the heart of the people melt. Yet I wholly followed the Lord my God." I don't think he's bragging. He's just suggesting that I was doing what the Lord asked us to do. And then verse 9, "And Moses swore on that day, saying, Surely the land on which your foot has trodden shall be an inheritance for you and your children forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God." Now, if nothing else, this is a beautiful picture of someone who is faithful to God despite adversity, difficulty, suffering in a sense for things that he himself had not done. And yet he is the picture of faithfulness. So then in verse 10, listen to what he says. "And now behold, the Lord has kept me alive." Interesting to think about it, isn't it? The Lord has kept me alive. 45 years ago, he was a young 40-year-old. Now he's an 85-year-old. And what he says is, God's the one that has blessed me with life. Think back over your years. I'll think over mine. Hasn't the Lord kept us alive day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, breath by breath? We go to bed at night and we kind of lie in a state of semi-consciousness for a few hours. What guarantee do we have that we're waking up? It's the Lord who blesses us with life, isn't it? And so it is that it is in him, as Paul said, we live and move and have our being. But then look at verse 11. Caleb says, "I am still as strong today as I was in the day that Moses sent me." Now, I don't know that many of us would make that claim, that we're still just as strong as we were 45 years ago. I think we understand that we're getting older, that we're not as strong as we were. But I think in part Joshua is saying, I'm just as ready to do what needs to be done as I was at age 40. He says, "My strength now is as my strength was then for war and for going and coming." Now, I don't know what his role was when they went into the promised land. Sounds to me like he was one of the individuals on the battle line. And so verse 12, he says, "So now give me this hill country of which the Lord spoke on that day. For you have heard on that day how the Anakim were there, with great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out just as the Lord said." I don't think he's expressing doubt. He's just saying, my trust is not in myself, my own strength. It is in the Lord who has promised these things to me. He's willing to take on the challenge. And he asks Joshua that he be granted this hill country. I remember reading about LBJ and the hill country in central Texas. Well, this is the hill country of Canaan. And he says, I would like to go in and possess that land. Even though the Anakim are still there, Caleb is showing this great determination on his part. Well, what happens is, and I won't read all of that account. If you turn over to chapter 15, verses 13 to 19, basically he does what he says he's going to do. He goes in and he takes that land. It's not an easy land to take. As we said, there are these taller, giant people that are in the land, and yet he takes it nevertheless. Verse 15 of chapter 15, he went up from there against the inhabitants of Debir. Now, the name of Debir formerly was Kiriath Sefer, and Caleb said, whoever strikes Kiriath Sefer and captures it, to him will I give Achsah, my daughter, as wife. So he conquers, and he even asks for the help of others. And lo and behold, there is an Othniel, the first judge of Israel, who ends up helping him in that venture, allowing him to conquer the territory that God has promised to him. Well, it's a wonderful story, isn't it, of someone who has aged both in time but in his maturity as far as his faith was concerned, whose faith has remained solid. So let's conclude with a few thoughts about this example that we see from Caleb. His confidence was certainly based on his faith in God, God's promises. No doubt the things that he had seen God do while in Egypt, the plagues that he had brought upon Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, the different examples where God had acted out there in the wilderness. And so that caused faith rather than doubt on Caleb's part. And that allowed him to overcome what was really a fear of the unknown. Often it's the case, isn't it, when we don't know what's before us, that we can become fearful. Was it wise for him to take on this task at this point in life? Well, I suppose his attitude was that expressed by James in chapter 4, 13 to 16. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town, spend a year there and trade and make profit, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? Why, it's like a mist that appears and vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. He had a certain humility in his attitude. It wasn't just that I can do it all, but he was willing to rely upon others, to ask the help of others. Think of Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. I, Paul says, can do all things. Now that sounds boastful, doesn't it, if you just stop there? But he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And Caleb's strength and faith was in his God. And all of this took place even as he became an older man. Well, I hope looking at Caleb's example will cause us to think about our own situations. We each have the challenges that we face, and sometimes it seems like those get more difficult as we grow older. But what we can rely upon is our faith in God and our trust in Him and the promises that He has made to us. May we take confidence from that. May we have a heart of courage that responds as Caleb did to the promises that God has given us. If you're here this evening, you're not a child of God, we've chosen this song about Joshua, Dare to Stand Like Joshua. I've been talking about Caleb, but we could probably insert Caleb in there for Joshua and come out about the same. Are you willing to do that? If you're not a Christian, are you ready to take a stand for truth and for what is right and to have your sins forgiven so that you can be a child of God and place your faith in Him? If that's your desire, won't you come as we stand?